I don't know when the words liberal or conservative became insults. What I do know is that I can't remember a time when they weren't. So maybe it's always been this way, at least to some degree. I don't know, I'm not sure. My guest on this episode of the podcast is a voice who shows up on what might be considered the conservative side of many conversations, online and off. I've watched her navigate the nuances of those engagements without slipping into the snark and dismissiveness that has become a hallmark of political argument. I've also marveled at her capacity to both belong to and deeply critique her own culture. She holds a Ph.D. She is a research professor of English and Christianity and culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's the author and contributor to a library of books, including a very recent book entitled Cultural Engagement, a crash course in contemporary issues. This is my conversation with Karen Swallow Prior. Check it out. Where are you calling me from? Where are you right now?
Central Virginia.
Okay. And you're still there. That's not where you're from. Where are you from?
Originally from Maine.
Okay. Where in Maine?
Near Augusta. Nowhere
Yes.
exotic. Yeah. I mean, not, inland.
Way out there.
Yeah. But then
and-
I lived in Buffalo and then moved to Virginia 21 years ago. So.
Does it still feel like home, Virginia?
Yes, it definitely feels like home. In a lot, I love it. It still is a foreign culture to me, but
Right.
growing up in the secular Northeast, but I love Virginia, the country, the weather, the beauty. So yeah, it's like Maine. It's kind of like Maine without the cold.
Virginia, like Maine, without the cold.
And not as many pine trees, but.
True. When you go back, do you often go back to Maine, visit family? Do you still have family there?
I still have, my brother lives there and my grandparents were, but they're both dead, and I have some other relatives there. So yeah, I get back every few years. But
And does that still feel like home?
Yes, absolutely. It's always home.
Yeah, like just emotionally, you feel like you've got to, because some folks move away and they just emotionally dissociate. Like, I don't recognize it. I don't feel at home there. Like, if they needed to leave, whatever. You still feel like your roots do you still feel like a Northeasterner living in Virginia?
Yes.
Fascinating. And when you talk about like the foreign culture of Virginia, like what makes it foreign to you? Like, where are the gaps?
It's the Bible Belt culture. The biggest shock was, which I just didn't even know that it existed until moving here, but just the cultural Christianity that serves basically like a vaccination against real Christianity.
Yes.
Because in the Northeast, it just, genuine Christians are so rare that when you find them, it's like you know them and there's community. And moving down here where people assume that they're Christians,
Correct.
but don't, it's just, I have never gotten over it. Like I just know how to talk to secularists and liberals, right, about Christianity, but I don't know how to talk to people who think, and maybe they are Christians. I'm not saying they're not Christians, but it's just.
But who the hell knows?
Weird.
That's kind of the thing. It's like you're assuming this.
Yeah.
I think was it Tyler Huckabee who tweeted recently? I wish I remembered the specific. I'm actually gonna go see if I can find it. He tweeted, it was like the other day, he said something along the lines of, cartoon Christianity. And he said like one of the upsides to, this is what he says, one of the perks of seeing cartoon Christianity used to prop up all sorts of malevolent stupidity, which is just such a great line. One of the perks of seeing cartoon Christianity used to prop up all sorts of malevolent stupidity is that I've become so much more grateful for the real thing. I love that. I'm not going to make a bunch of assumptions. I'm going to ask some questions. I mean, your work as an academic, your work in public, it lands right here in that tension, right? Like constantly between like what's cartoonish, what's real. You're constantly parsing I would assume for yourself personally, but a lot of what you end up doing, it seems, in public is to help other people parse. Are there things for you that are distinctive of a more actually authentic, is not exactly the word I want to use here, but like a non-cartoonish experience of God, of the divine? Like what are the hallmarks of the difference between what's cartoon religion and what's actual religious practice for you or for the world around you? Are there things that you look for? Is there a scent? Like how do you determine?
I'm just fixating for a moment on the whole cartoon religion thing because that's just brilliant.
Yes, it
And
is.
yeah, that needs to become that just captures so much. Okay, so back to your question. Okay, so what is the difference? What are some hallmarks in the of non-cartoonish
Yeah, for you,
Christianity?
like
Yes,
knowing the difference
yes.
between like this is garbage or
Mhm.
semi-garbage, and
Mhm. Mhm.
to know that to some degree has to come through the filter of knowing what isn't.
Mhm.
Are there ways that you personally or academically or culturally identified this is real or more real?
Well, some of the things that I would consider hallmarks that I never really thought were that distinct until, the recent years were things like the ability and desire to have conversations with people who don't believe like you do so that you can learn from them and they can learn from you. Like
Yeah.
that seems like a no-brainer to me, but I'm realizing, that a lot of people, whether it's because of their belief in degrees of separation or
Right.
purity or fear or whatever that, or what things look like, the appearances, um, that's not something that a lot of people see as a hallmark of
Hmm.
genuine Christianity. So just conversations with people who don't believe as you do, whether, they profess to be Christians or not.
Yes.
Um, and another hallmark of non-cartoonish Christianity would be not assuming or identifying completely with a political party as, the equivalent of
Hmm.
your faith. Um, Again, this is something that seems to have emerged in the past few years, but obviously has been brewing for a while, where that conflation seems increasingly prevalent. Um, I mean, these just seem really basic to me, so I haven't had
Yeah.
to, I'm not, if I thought more deeply, I think just the willingness or the assumption, really, or just that one um, reads or discusses challenging ideas, those ideas that you might not believe in or agree with, and that one wants to have an open mind and be willing to ask hard questions and to talk to those who doubt or disagree, which is kind of the first thing that I said. But even just for
Yeah.
ourselves, having a conversation with other people, but also having an ongoing conversation with ourselves about what we believe and why we believe it, and kind of checking in, saying, oh, why do I believe this, or why do I think this,
Yeah.
or so those are just a few.
Self-examination.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, it is an odd bit, right? That like those things would seem like those are just common sense. But oddly
I would
enough,
have thought.
one would have thought, but oddly enough, self-examination and the ability to have conversations with someone who, or people in general, who don't line up with you, they're suddenly, what seems sudden, they do seem sudden. They're suddenly bars to clear. That's like a hoop to jump through. Like,
Mhm.
can you do
Mhm.
this basic thing? It's like, whoa, I thought,
Mhm.
I don't think we're running. This is walking. How are we having a hard time walking? Do you feel like there has been like an actual shift away from civility and conversation, from reflection? Like, did something shift, or were we exposed? Right? Like, because there's a little bit of a thing here.
Mhm.
Is this like, hey, the sick belly of um the sick underbelly of white evangelicalism has been exposed. And this is one narrative. And like, oh my gosh, look at all of the misogyny. And it has been there. did things change? Did things shift? Was it this way? I mean, did we get exposed or did something change?
Well, that is sort of the $25,000 question. And I mean, I'm going to take the easy way out and just say both.
Okay.
Um, and it's, something that I'm still thinking about because it's actually something I'm still sort of seeing for myself. So, I do think, one thing that has changed, and just to go back to something I said earlier, I mean, I talked about moving to the Bible Belt and what a culture shock that was,
right,
because it's just sort of insulated and there are a lot of assumptions. Well, that sort of geographical and cultural echo chamber, to use that term, which is what I see it now as, is something that's replicated in a lot of other ways through social media and other kinds of groupings and organizations. So what was once a geographical echo chamber, now we see that in different forms that transcend, physical place and geography. So so that seems that increases the kinds of tendencies that we are talking about, and other kinds of tendencies as well. So I think there is an increase and a change of a sort of a what is the mathematical term for it? We see an exponential increase or something, and something that was already there.
Right.
And what was already there, this sort of underbelly of white evangelicalism, I'm seeing more and more. I mean, of course, I'm concerned about sexism, more concerned really about racism. And I do think, something I'm starting to think through is that it really does have less to do with sex and race per se as it does just simply with power. And it happens to be, for a lot of reasons, that, it's white men who've been in power for, most of the human history, especially in Western civilization. And because I don't think that people of other races or sexes would be immune to the same kinds of abuses. And so that's why I want to be careful and talk about what really underlies it. Because I do think it's a human problem, and it just happens to be that the people in power now and for a long time are white men, and so in addressing this problem as a woman, or as as a racial, I'm not a racial minority, but as I work with racial minorities and other minorities, we have to be really careful that to quote those great 20th century philosophers, the Who, that we don't get fooled again, right?
Yes.
And that the old boss isn't, that we don't replace the old boss with a new boss.
Yes.
So anyway, that's kind of what I'm thinking about these days in terms of that.
So in a sense, I mean, you're not willing to or wanting to diagnose whiteness as principally or fundamentally corrupt, so much as recognize the issue with whiteness is the abuse of power. Right.
And any one of us could also do that. Maybe we'd be less likely to. I mean, if we consider, the role that maybe physical strength has to play in that, then maybe it is going to be more likely to be men. And there are lots of factors that play into it, but we're still all human, and we're still all as corruptible by these temptations as the next guy.
So what I'd like to do, and I often do this a little bit later in conversation, but it's kind of like a game. It's not really a game. It is a game. We're gonna play a game. The game, right. It's this sort of practice of lexicon. In other words, like the words we use. I'll just talk about you. The words that you use have a particular angle and bent. So when I'm blanking on the name of the poet, Emily Dickinson, who writes, tell the truth, but tell it slant. Like recognize that what words you use are not standardized across culture. They're your
Right.
words, and you have to own your own angle on them. There are particular words and worlds that you function in, and what I like to do is I'm just going to put a word on the table and just have you vamp on it. Whether it's like a definition, like here's what this is, or
Mm-hmm.
this just kind of reflection about like whatever kind of the word draws out of you. And I want to start with the word evangelical. Because you wrote a book, I think you were part of a book about I think it's called Still Evangelical. It was Mark Laberton, who was a mentor of mine, who helped edit the book. You're in the book with, I think, Shane Claiborne and Lisa Sharon Harper, and talking about like your history with and engagement with this word, this culture, this thing called evangelicalism. Can you talk about like what does it mean for you? What is evangelical for you now? Is it different? Just talk about the word evangelical. What's it draw out of you?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, if we're doing sort of the word association game, and you asked me to think of the first thing that pops into my head when I hear that word, the first thing that I think of is um, the 18th century British evangelicals like the Wesleys, and then later William Wilberforce and Hannah More, those who, brought about so many social reforms, including the abolition of slavery and advocacy for animal welfare and for child laborers and all of those things. And I realize that connotation is so far removed from what most people in 2021 think of.
Yes.
But that is not only the origin of the movement, but it's also where I spent, years of my life in study and research. And so it is a word that means a great deal to me. And that is what I think of. It is a word that covers 300 years of history, none of it perfect, some of it bad, but some of it good. And it just really saddens me that it is a word that has become so narrowed and stripped of its rich layers because of the 2016 election and all the polling and the reports in the media. And it's kind of the tail wagging the dog when evangelicals themselves, whether they use that term or not, have allowed headlines and polls to redefine a very rich heritage. And that's not to say that the movement and the word doesn't come to some end, and something else gets born, because these things happen over hundreds of years. And we're 300 years into this movement, so I'm not saying that it won't become something else or give birth to something else. But still, if it does, it needs to do that because of larger sweeps and more and deeper wrestling than just connotations given to it by Americans in 2016, because this is a much it's a global term, and it doesn't belong to just us.
Are you suggesting that Americans tend to define things in small ways?
No.
Maybe.
And in small and very self-focused ways. We just can't see outside of ourselves or our time. I mean, just look at this pandemic that we're in, and I just marvel at people who, regardless of all, so complicated, so many things to think about, but just the lack of people really knowing and just sitting with the fact that these things happen every 100 years, and there's nothing special about us except we have vaccines, and we can actually probably overcome it more easily than they did 100 years ago or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago with the bubonic plague. Like, we are just, we are babies. Spoiled
Speaking of babies, do the same thing with church. What is church? What does the word church do in your head, your heart, your body now? Like, when you hear the word church, what happens for you now?
I think when I hear the word church, I first hear the church,
Hmm.
so I think of the church. I think of the bride of Christ, and just how precious and beautiful she is, and how Christ is still purifying and cleansing her. And we all that we if we are believers, we are called to be part of that. Um, Whatever that means, whatever denominational or geographical or whatever,
Right.
place where God has put us, we are called to be part of that church body. Um, so I think of that. And but more recently, in more recent days, when I think of church, I think of something that that feels distant to me, because I haven't gone into physical worship since the pandemic,
Mhm.
for a couple of reasons. Because my primary um, concern is to protect the health of my elderly parents,
Yes.
who live with us and whom I care for. And beyond that, even my own, selfishly, I'm just not. I've spent more time in a hospital than I need to for the rest of my life, so I just, I'm not taking risks that would get me sick.
Right.
I don't think most people are as cautious as I am, so I have a pretty high bar. And so church, in that sense, also just there's a little bit of longing and
Hmm.
wistfulness and nostalgia that's tied up with the pandemic, and the desire to hopefully return to something more like normal
Hmm.
someday soon.
Can you talk about the word masculinity?
Oh, wow. So there's a, there's a, when I hear that word, I first think of this sort of cartoonish version that's circulating out there on the internet, which just, uh, if it weren't so, I mean, it makes me laugh, but it makes me sad too, because it is so surface level and distorted. And again, because I studied history so much through literature, and my period of specialty is the 18th century and of course 17th century, lots of British literature. And so there are so many great men who wore, velvet and ruffles and wigs, and they were brilliant theologians and
And some of my favorite
philosophers
men
and
still do
writers.
wear
And so,
ruffles and
yes,
velvet. Can we be
and they
honest?
yes, yes. And so when I contrast this idea of masculinity, that again is so 21st century American conservative evangelical, against the men that I have, sat with and studied metaphorically, for so many years, I just don't know how to reconcile that. And of course, that doesn't mean
Hmm.
that there weren't, the models from history are the best
Hmm.
or perfect models. It's not
Right.
that at all. I mean, they're all informed by the times and the culture. And then when I think, I just always think of my own husband when I hear the word
Hmm.
masculinity, because i- he he is such a good man that, and no offense to any present company here, but like, he is not on social media.
Huh.
He is he's a teacher, and he's a provider, and he's a builder, and he's a hunter, and he's an artist, and he's a giver, and he's a caretaker. He's all of these things. And the last thing on earth that he would do in his role in all of these masculine things is to like debate what masculinity is on Twitter. So it just, all of those things, it just makes me laugh,
Hmm.
because it's almost like, if you what is the thing that you say and it no longer exists? Silence. That word, however
Hmm.
that little riddle
Yes.
goes. And I think, what is the thing that if you talk about it on Twitter you can't be? And it's like masculine.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just
I like that.
my biased view.
Let's talk for a minute about living online. I mean, you mentioned your husband doesn't. You do. You spend some time. You spend some time online. You spend some time
Yeah.
in the odd, strange, dark cesspool of, I don't even know what to call it anymore, that we call Twitter. Is it a necessity for you? Is it a chore for you? Like, talk about your experience living online as an academic, as a woman, as a mom, like your experience of life online, in to some degree, like touching on one of those third rail topics oftentimes, on several of them, because you're in religion, you're in politics, you're in academia, and there you are on Twitter, oftentimes taking shots, sometimes doling some out. Do you like living online? Is it just a chore? Is it healthy? Just talk about, like, let's start with there. Like, do you like being there? Do you like being online? Do you like using Twitter? Is it a happy place?
It's so complicated. So
Right.
we have to go back to whatever year it was that Facebook was invented.
Yes, 16 years ago.
Yes. Okay. So
It's a
I
freaking
was
teenager. People forget about this. Like, they're like, oh, the internet. It's a teenager. Of course, it's a damn mess.
Yeah. Well, when Facebook came out and my students started to use it, I was curious. And when it first came out, you could only get on it. It was for college students. And so you could only get on it if you had an EDU email address. So that would be college students, but also professors like I was. And so I got on it because basically, first I wanted to see what my students were talking about. And then as soon as I got on, I started using it as a way to extend my classroom, and to, like, it was so easy to post things. So if we were having a discussion in the classroom, then I would post something, either an article related to it or just talk about what we were talking about. And so from the beginning, I viewed Facebook as an extension of my classroom. And eventually, when I got on Twitter, one of my students, a couple of my students actually told me, "Oh, you'd be great on Twitter." I was like, "What is Twitter?" And at first I hated it. I didn't understand how to use it. But I got on it. And again, I'd been on Facebook for a few years. And so I just, again, treated it almost like a classroom.
Just pause for a second. Like, what a strange compliment nowadays. We're like, you'd be good on Twitter, because it's such a weird thing to say nowadays. It's like you'd be good at driving. Wait, what? What are you talking about? Is it a thing? Are people good? Are people good or bad at Twitter? And I guess they are, but what an odd thing to say.
Well, yeah. And my students, they called it. I was just thinking of those two students the other day and what they said, and I was like, wow, what do they think of me now? So I treated it. I always saw it as a classroom, and again, it's sharing articles is my love language. That's just like what I do. So tweeting art, that's really, it's more than that, but that's still kind of what I do on Facebook and on Twitter. I started cultivating conversations on Facebook. I don't do it as much now because I don't have as much time, but I mean, I would have, I still do now and then, these long extended conversations on Facebook with a diverse, audience. And so I became known for being able to sort of cultivate and and moderate these conversations. And so I still see that as valuable. Obviously, I'm still there. I think it's a great way of sharing ideas. Now I see it as something different and perhaps more important, especially Twitter.
More important now.
More important. I see it as a mission field.
Fascinating.
Because social media is the driving force behind so much that's happening today. And even though I literally every day, several times a day, fantasize about not being on social media and just reading books instead, because obviously I could spend more time reading. I mean, I still read books, but obviously I could spend more time. And I think about it and I wonder, and I just want to do that. And
Yeah.
I need to moderate my time on social media. But of course, a lot of people have just left it altogether. I know some great
Yeah.
thinkers and writers who've just left it, and I think about doing that.
Do
And
you have respect for
I,
that? Like what, because it's sort of
oh,
the high ground
absolutely,
move, right? And I don't know what to
right.
think of it. This is part of why I'm asking. I don't exactly know what to think about it. I understand from some people's standpoint, like from the standpoint of mental health, like if you're beat up, like I look at, I think you may know Kristen Powers from CNN, and like
Hmm.
I've never seen anyone take shots the way she takes shots. It's unreal the way she gets beat up on Twitter. And so it would make sense to me if someone like Kirsten was like, I'm just done. This hurts too much. I'm done. People like blowing her up about her makeup. Like she's like, this is a take on like massive social issues, and you're actually talking about her makeup right now. I get that. The part of it that's strange for me is when folks do take the odd moral high ground where it's like, this is a deeply corrupt place and I just don't want to have
Hmm.
anything to do with it.
Hmm.
I don't know
Hmm.
what to do with that. I don't know how to feel about folks who believe
Hmm.
the Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, that it's all gross. And because it's gross, I can't be there. That
Hmm.
sounds wrong to me. And I don't know if I'm wrong to feel that way.
Hmm.
So, I mean, do you have respect
Well,
for
it's,
folks who
I mean,
bounce for those reasons?
um, I do, in the sense if it's doing something bad to them, but not if it's. I mean, it is a form. These are formative practices. There is no denying that. And it's. I guess it's like, and not choosing not to go to the mall because you don't believe in everything that it's stands for, as opposed to kind of getting on the planning commission
Hmm.
in your community to plan something else that's better, right? I mean, you can
Yes.
just refrain from going to the mall, or you can be part of a community that has a voice in doing something different. Now, I again, like, maybe we can't really make Twitter that different, but for me, I feel a responsibility until I'm released to a sense of that responsibility and calling, because I do think I do Twitter well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I've had people contact me, and I'm numerous. I mean, they are learning, they are watching. I mean, I'm not trying to save all mankind by being on Twitter, um, but it seems to be making a difference in
Hmm.
people, in some people's lives and thinking and the way they behave. And that's it. I sometimes just think, I hate that I'm called to Twitter. Like, I
Hmm.
would rather be called to writing, award winning, academic, books that are praised all the world over. And I'm like, I'm called to Twitter. It feels very humbling and low, I'll be honest, at times.
Yeah.
But it is, I feel called to it. And I'm, until, and it obviously does benefit me. I don't, like my platform,
Yeah.
that I have, I probably wouldn't have, be able to publish the books that I published with the publishers I have if I didn't have,
Yeah.
X number of followers.
It
I
is the thing they
understand that
look at.
game. Yeah,
They,
yeah.
here are your numbers and
So,
here are ours.
but I pray and hope that I'm using it for good
Yeah.
until I'm called to something else.
Yeah, there's something to be said for Andy Crouch's pretty insightful take that the real only I don't think he says only. He says the best critique of bad culture is better culture. That if
Mm.
that like
Hmm.
great, that's neat. You have a critique. You and everyone has a freaking critique. Everyone's got a critique. It's the easiest thing in the world to be like, this sucks. Okay, great.
Hmm. Hmm.
What are you doing? Is the other side of it, and that's the part of it that I really do admire the way you posture yourself in conversation online, because there are expectations people come to you with, and you do a really good job of navigating that. You actually culture make with your online spaces. I'm thankful for folks like you who are not, because it's not just like you're taking shots all day. You really do culture make, and you've curated an actual space in your social media circles or spheres where there's a different tone and expectation, which is, again, I come back to Facebook is 16 years old. Like, of course, it's a
Wow.
freaking mess. But like, I was an utter disaster at 16. I mean, hell, I was an
Mhm.
utter disaster at
Mhm.
26. Like, I was a freaking mess. The notion somehow that it as a platform, or that we on this platform should just be able to see straight and know what the hell we're doing at this point. That's a thing
Mhm.
you forge. It's not a thing that
Mhm.
happens. Like, it's not, we don't, like, it doesn't somehow make sense
Mhm.
because it makes sense. No, you make
Right.
sense of it. So I'm thankful
Well,
for
and
your posture there.
well, thank you. And it's, I find a lot of instruction again in looking at history. So the period of my specialty is the rise of print culture. And so in the 17th and 18th century, when, it became, being able to print things rapidly and lots of things uh, cheaply, and they were all these print publications, whether it was pamphlets or newspapers or journals, and
Mhm.
early novels, people were freaking out because
Yes.
of all of this stuff being printed and people being able to read it and being vulnerable to believing things that weren't true, and thinking that a novel was real, and thinking Gulliver's Travels really was a real story, and printing heresy and treason and all
Right.
of these things. It was a disaster.
Or at
But
least, or at least a potential disaster.
a potential, right? Everyone was afraid, and so yeah. But now we have, like, people can read, and we publish it, like, few hundred years later. We have sort of mastered print culture,
Hmm.
and now we have digital culture, and it's we're panicking again, and we will figure it out. We're still in this. We will 50 years from now look back and go, oh, how could people have been so naive to believe you know everything that they read on the internet? Like, you know they will look back at us and think we were silly and naive, and because we'll get more sophisticated, we'll figure it out, and then something else will come along. It's just, human history.
Your political engagement. I think this is right. The your most recent publication is the cultural engagement book, the Crash Course in Contemporary Issues. Is that correct? You and
Yes.
okay. Um, the ability to, or the choice to, enter into political conversation. I mean, that book was, I think, July of last year.
Yes.
Um, and uh, y- the world. I don't even know how to describe this at this point. I guess I'll ask you this: did you see things going this badly? Um, Not just in terms of, like, you know, the asinine ridiculousness that is Donald Trump as a public figure and a politician, but more to the point, like, the utter inability for anyone, almost across the board, with very few exceptions, to talk about anything that matters in a way that, like, moves and changes minds. Like, I think minds do change online. Like you said, I think it's an important place. I never saw it getting this bad or this difficult. Did you see it
Mm.
getting this difficult, this bad? Can talk
No.
about, like, political conversation in general, but specifically political conversation online. You've been in these kind of tenuous spaces for a long time. You've been in conversation with folks who've held a considerable amount of power in terms of, like, white evangelical influence, etc. Did you see it going this dark? Does it make sense to you? Does this feel out of the blue? And is there hope for, like, the next 2 or 3 years, or is this how it is?
Um, no, I mean, I did not see it going like this. I think actually the publication of this book last year was kind of a wake up call. It got
Hmm.
blacklisted in certain circles simply
Wait, it
because
did?
yeah, I mean, I'm using that word and not going into detail, but there
Wow.
were people who opposed the book because it did what we what we wanted it to do, which was to have views that we don't agree with in it, and to be examined and discussed. Going back to the earlier part of our conversation, because I naively assumed that genuine believers not only can handle that, but seek it out.
Hmm.
Uh, but everyone is so, like, afraid of, like, oh, if I, platform this, or I'm seen with this person, I'm marked. I don't know. There's just a real panic, I guess, among those
Hmm.
who hold power, that, very tenuously, and just how easily that power could be taken away by a wrong move or a wrong photo op, or I didn't know that these things were that tenuous. And then we've just seen that escalate where it is pretty, people are clinging so tightly and so desperately to whatever it is that they have, that they're willing to, I guess, to sell out,
Hmm.
to tweet, out their support of this crazy notion or that crazy notion, just to get the approval from those people.
Yeah.
So it is bad, but here's the good thing.
Hmm.
What is happening in all this is that the veil is being lifted. We are seeing what it is that people are striving after and what they hold valuable and dear. And we are seeing the methods and the means they are willing to engage in for their ends. And it's a revelation. It's
Hmm.
an apocalypse. And
Yes.
like all apocalypses, it's really awful. But I believe that God, in His mercy, is showing us things that we, at least for me, that I didn't see before.
Hmm.
And I'm thanking Him for it, even as painful as it is to see.
Are there ways? My daughter is in her bedroom directly above my garage, and she's losing her mind right now. So I will I'll edit a lot of that out. Are there ways, in terms of like Revelation, Apocalypse, the unveiling? Are there ways that you see yourself differently now that are surprising? In other words, actually, I set this question up this way: is a number of years ago, like one of the most formative experiences of my life. I went with I was on a record label. I was playing music, and I went with Frank Tate, who's the label head, and we went to this showcase, and and the whole morning was, for the most part, label head standing up saying, this artist is amazing, this record's amazing, you're gonna love it. Here's some free stuff. Everybody stand and clap. The greatest thing since the Beatles, kind of stuff. And Frank didn't say that. Frank got up in front of like 250 like radio executives and music buyers and store heads, and he said, this is Justin McRoberts, and he's the artist we'll be focusing on this year. And I'll be honest, he's not very good right now. And then the room freaked for a moment, and then he said, what I'm counting on though is that a lot of the artists you've seen this morning won't be playing music 2 or 3 years from now because it's hard. I think Justin will be around 15 years from now, and I think he'll be making better work, and I'm making a long-term investment. If you want to make it with me, great. If not, I don't care. And they walked off the stage, and I had to play a song. And I was like, this song sucks, apparently. So here you go. But what he did was he set this tone of like, oh, like I can have like a longer-term vision for who I'm becoming. And there are things over the course of that 15 years that like, oh, I was hoping that would happen. And then there are things socially, emotionally, really specifically, to some degree theologically, like I didn't see becoming that person. I didn't see thinking this way. You, your consistency over time has been an incredible value to the folks who follow you. That you're, I want to use the word dependable, but that's not exactly the way I want to say it. But there's this kind of like faithfulness and reliability to you, to your work, to your character over time. Are there ways that, as you are now, like you did not see becoming, like this is who you are now? You look at what your place in life, the things you think, the things you believe, the way you work in the world. Are you surprised at anything in you or about you right now that like 15 years ago you just would not have seen coming?
Well, I don't think I would have seen myself on Twitter. And I certainly, I never thought that I would be a seminary professor at a Southern Baptist institute. I mean, I've been Baptist my whole life, but I just never saw myself as a seminary professor. And I never saw myself in, if I were at a Southern Baptist seminary, just, so that's just been an amazing thing. But I feel like this might be, I mean, is probably cliche and could easily be taken the wrong way, but I feel like I've remained the same in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and the world around me has changed. Um, I think, for example, I mean, anyone who knows me knows I'm passionately pro-life. I've spent years protesting at abortion clinics and getting arrested, and all those things. And I'm too old and have other things to do. I'm not that young anymore to do those kinds of things. But I still feel the same passion. Well, I bring that same passion to other social issues that are pressing today, like
Hmm.
the race issue and the abuse issue. So to me, that those are all part of the same passion for justice and for right and for and for protection of the vulnerable. And yet we're in the world that I'm in, people see these as highly politicized things, or they
Hmm.
oppose them altogether. And so I feel like I've just I was just finished up reading C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, which I haven't read in a long time, or had read in its completion. I don't know. But, there's that famous part where he talks about, part of being in heaven is that we become more and more ourselves. And well, maybe we're in hell now, but but I by the grace of God, I just feel like even in these hard years, and the sex abuse crisis in the church, and then me getting hit by a bus, all of these things that have been hard to go through, like God is just helping me to become more myself, and who, and I want who He created me to be, and that's all that I want is for myself. And so yeah, I guess that's my answer.
That's good. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks for making some space this morning.
Well, thank you for the honor of having this conversation. I pray it edifies any who might be listening.
Yeah. In the park near my house is a series of trails that intersect a small creek in a few spots, and in the winter, that creek rises and it's almost impossible to cross at one location. So a few years ago, someone built a bridge over that spot. They saw a problem and they created a solution in order to address it. Then a week or so later, someone else tore it down. And then in response, the original builder took some of the broken pieces from the first bridge and used them to assemble a new bridge. And I think that's actually how life works and moves forward, which is why I wrote that story into my next book entitled It Is What You Make of It. 15 stories that push back against the kind of it is what it is thinking that keeps us from entering into the world around us and living fully. The book comes out on June 1st. You can pre-order it now. I hope you do. And thank you for listening to this episode of the At Sea Podcast. If you would like to follow up with Karen Swallow Prior, you can jump to KarenSwallowPrior.com. Karen with a K, Swallow with 2 L's, the way it's normally spelled, and then Prior is P-R-I-O-R, KarenSwallowPrior.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, we'd love to have you on the team. We are up to some really interesting stuff over the next year, and we're looking for some people to support those efforts. You can jump to Patreon.com and search my name, Justin McRoberts. Again, we'd love to have you on the team. Until next time.